Hello, this is Dean, and this is my podcast on self-awareness is the topic I'd like to talk about today. So, one can hardly underemphasize or understate the importance of self-awareness. And I'd like to introduce the idea that self-awareness is a kind of a property of mind, and that mind is a property of brain. And we might almost replace the term self-awareness with that of sentience. And that it's part of what's vitally missing from AI as it currently stands. However creative it might be, it really doesn't know what it is. And I would argue that what is different between humans and animals, and from us and our previous state, through most of the 200,000 or 250,000 years or so of our existence, that is different within the last 30,000 years, and in particular within the last 10,000 years, is a kind of step up in self-awareness, and that this is essentially a software change, not a hardware change. It is not derived from biology. Now, I would argue that a certain amount of intelligence requires a certain amount of biology to facilitate it, and in turn, a certain amount of intelligence is required in order to have this quality that I'm talking about, and there can be more or less of this quality of mind. So, in other words, we can say that potentially if you make something more intelligent, whether a machine or an animal, that it might be able to afford sentience. The truth is that just because it has intelligence, or a person has intelligence, doesn't necessarily mean that they have more of this quality. And that the quality itself leads people to be people and to have certain functions that work better according to whether or not you have more of this quality of self-awareness. So one of the first things one might point out along these lines is, and one of the most important, is the ability to ask why you're doing what you're doing, and not just how you're going to go about doing it. I would argue that in the case of an animal that we think about as being a slave to its instincts, that the real reason why it's a slave to its instincts is it's because it's lacking the conceptual ability to conceptualize and understand and examine its own motives. That it doesn't mean that it doesn't know anything about them, or else it wouldn't be able to act on them, but at the same time being able to speak it out in words the way that we can, or even just fathom it concretely within the mind as a kind of abstract object, is something I think that is a capability that's beyond most animals. If they have it, they only have it to a limited degree, where human beings have more of it. And you'll note that this doesn't take away our instincts or make them weaker. It makes our motives more tractable to our reasoning mind. We can see what it is that we're trying to do and why a little more easily, and make determinations about how that weighs out against other possible motives. So that I think that it affects both the range of possibilities that we have in our own behavior to select from, but also the way in which we see the world itself is opened up by this ability to more accurately self-reflect. More, I would say that I think that this quality that I'm talking about gives human beings the capacity to understand, or any thinking entity, the ability to understand and anticipate what some other entity is thinking or is going to decide to do. And it allows us to stand, so to speak, in someone else's shoes. And again, I think that it's true to say that any animal with a brain has that capacity to a degree in order for that brain to be useful in evolution, but we have substantially more capacity to be able to do that potentially than other animals do. Although looking around yourselves, you can see that there's some distinctions between people and how much of this quality that they have. It's a faculty like a muscle to be exercised to be able to do these two things, to be able to ask yourself why and tolerate that. And some people don't. They don't like that question. And also to be able to, even if the person that you're trying to understand is someone who you're dead set against, like in a chess match. You have to think of what the other person's going to do. You have to think about what moves they're going to make given the next move that you make in order to win the game. Although it challenges us because it can lead to empathy and sympathy, and sometimes we don't want that. The truth is that this is a strength and a faculty which must be exercised in people in order to get them to make more complex decisions. And thus, our motives are more liquid and capable of being changed with enough effort on our part. Sometimes some motives may be more difficult to change than others, but we are at least capable of it. And that the real reason why is not just because our instincts are weaker or that our resolve is stronger, but also that basis, that foundation of being able to see those motives in the first place. It also allows us to be able to see how other people are going to be likely to respond or to think or to do. Now, it is my assertion that this faculty of mind that leads to other functional capabilities is one of software, not hardware. It is learned, but it is not something that you gain more of simply by understanding it. So having it just pointed out might be helpful, but is not in and of itself a strengthening or an increase of the thing being discussed. So when we think about information coming into our brain through our senses, like our ears from some other person, we think about ideas as being things that can be understood and modeled within the mind. But what also is being modeled is the point of view from which the other person may be speaking, if we're taking information in from another person as a source. And when we model that, we have the capacity potentially to also model these underlying faculties that are gained in this way almost through induction, right? So the way that this software is passed around is by talking to people and helping them to understand things, but at the same time, it may be somewhat indirect. You could be talking about a huge assortment of different things in your life, and the way in which you think is revealed by that, and then that is modeled in another person's mind. And if it's done in fertile ground, so to speak, or a person who has the capacity for it, and if it's modeled enough, they may go on to imitate it unconsciously. So I would posit that sentience is not something that is gained through understanding and yet helps to increase the capacity and efficiency of understanding. It's an underlying mechanic. Also from this, we can see that if it's something that's being passed along from person to person unconsciously as they speak about different things and different topics, that it is in a way like a mind virus. And that's something that to some extent is a topic that's covered by other people in the past, things like the concept of a meme as being a mind virus came about really before the age of the internet really took off, and most people have taken to that as just being a reality, that if you have an idea or even just the outward expression of an idea, that it can spread. So I would say that the original mind virus, or the most important one, happened around the time of the last glacial maximum and probably helped to save human beings from extinction, because they went through a very near extinction event at that time. And that sentience, in the way in which I'm talking about it, was that mind virus. It's kind of the original. More, I think that when this happened, it it happened because of changes that happened to the social and cultural structure amongst human beings. There were things there that must have facilitated it. One way to look at it is to look at a tribe of human beings as being almost like a human cell, almost like a biological cell that's evolving and competing against other similar cells, not just individual human beings, but the groups of them. And that what is contained within that, although to some extent it's genetics and biology, I think more importantly, it's culture. And that the introduction of not just a chief, but a separate figure that is the storyteller, is the shaman, acts as a reciprocal memory within the decision-making process of the tribe that makes up its central core. And that the addition of that memory or its improvement or improvements to the language too would allow for the compression of stories of things that happened, like a hunt or whatever, and layered on top of one another into stories that become mythologized and aren't about Og who lived 3 generations ago, but instead become archetypal stories as they gain similarity to one another. And this is a kind of a form of compression. And that these stories impart wisdom that the chief then uses to make decisions. So you see a decision-making unit being formed out of a group of human beings that has to take separate consideration. And that this supercharged the evolution of the information that we contain and exchange and allowed that underlying structure to evolve, come to exist, and it's still evolving today, updating itself and then spreading. Sometimes, like I say, in steady increments, but other times in fits and starts, I would assert. And again, you don't have to accept that. I'm not going to go through all of the evidence that I see in history that that's the case, but it explains an awful lot, I think, about us. The idea that really human beings, in a substantial sense, thought differently and had a different basis of mind going back into the past, and that revolutionary figures or movements of thought and mind and culture, what they're really instilling is not just a group of ideas like how to domesticate grain or goats, but instead the underlying mental process that allows us to see that as being possible and opens up a new range of available choices to us given circumstances we now can more clearly see due to functions that are more unconscious to us but do get passed between us. Now, I'll take the time here for a moment to point out that I am not a scientist and that you can go ahead and mistrust and should mistrust everything that I say about this. More, if I'm being responsible about trying to spread this idea or put it out there for other people to hear, that it stands against some of the current mainstream thinking about mind and brain. A recent change has gone on that tries to show that somehow or other it's an extreme non-dualism stance within the mainstream thoughts about cognition that says that brain is equal to mind, that there really is no such thing as mind, and all that really is just your brain. This and specifically this stands against the idea that a brain is computing anything, that's a form of computation. This assertion is in essence broken, in my opinion. I'm going to run against the mainstream here, which puts this into the realm potentially of pseudoscience from some people's point of view, which is, okay, it's fine. I'm at least being honest about that. But I vehemently disagree with the absolutist identification of mind and brain. The truth is that I think differently because of what I've been taught and my environment as much as anything that's inherent to my brain. And in fact, I think that what is inherent to you in terms of brain and your genetics could only constitute a very small portion of the distinction of who you are as a human being or the functions that you carry out. The truth is that there's really only about a gigabyte of information contained total within the human genome. And so that's all the information space that there is to describe how to create a functioning sentient mind like the one that you have. And the truth is, that just doesn't leave a whole lot of room, given your endocrine system and your immune system and everything else, to be able to describe things like what it is that we're talking about right now as though that could possibly just be biology. It's not. It can't be. The biology facilitates it and is necessary to have there in order for it to exist, but is not possible to use as an explanation for the total of what cognition actually is. And it also speaks to a vacuous idea of what computation is or what information is. Mostly it's a point of view that's been pushed, as far as I know, by people whose field of study is closer to biology than it is to philosophy or logic. And the truth is that computation, they have a very narrow definition of it as being something that goes on inside of a machine that is made out of metal that human beings build, right? But the truth is that computational processes, as described by Turing, can be carried out by a great many different types of mechanisms. I think that there was actually a Turing complete machine that was built by some college students using rubber bands and clothespins or something. So the reality is that the definition of computation should be held as being fairly broad, and that it's without doubt that neurons, just given their basic structure and what they're doing, form a part of a computational process, that mind is a meta of brain, that it sits on top of it and needs the brain to exist, yes. And different functions may have different places in the brain that they're specialized at carrying out. All of that is good and true, and I don't deny any of that. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that a caveman can do calculus without having to think about it. You have to be taught those things. And just the fact that information can be input and that your decision making can change as a result should be kind of an indicator that it's kind of limited what it is that we are innately. I would argue very strongly against this idea of innateness. And in fact, I think it's part of the bigger, broader problem as a concept in our politics and in our world, in the way in which it's de-evolved recently. This underlying assumption that the kind of character and nature of a person somehow is innate and immutable.